In this video, I'm going to fundamentally reshape the way that you think about Republicans in relation to Ukraine. Now, I know that that's quite a promise, but stay with me. Now, that's particularly true if you're an American liberal or someone on the left side of the political spectrum, or if you're a European and you don't actually understand how the Republicans, conservatives work in the United States. If you're a conservative, tell me if I'm wrong. I am a conservative, and I find that if you want to understand how a certain people think, ask the people that are actually self-designated as those kind of people. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through this article, Republican 2024 hopefuls respond to Tucker Carlson's questions about their stance on Russia-Ukraine war. And as I go through it, I'm going to try to unpack for you what's going on, how Republicans actually think. And what you'll find is that first, Republicans are not monolithic, just like any other group. There's some factions within the party. Second, there's a lot more Republican support than what you might think. And third, it's going to help you see some nuance and the bigger picture of how Republicans think. So I'm going to go through this, and I'm going to read a number of quotes along the way because what happened was Tucker Carlson was asking these Republicans a series of questions. Now I'm going to tell you the questions, and then I'm going to give you the Biden administration's answer on it, and then I'll tell you which Republicans said what to answer the questions. Okay? So the first question is opposing Russia in Ukraine a vital American national strategic interest? Now, the Biden administration would say, yes, it is. What specifically is our objective in Ukraine, and how will we know when we've achieved it? Well, the Biden administration isn't exactly clear, but they tend to line up with Zelensky about pushing the Russians out of Ukraine, and that includes potentially Crimea. Next, what is the limit of funding and material you would be willing to send to the government of Ukraine? And Biden has said whatever is necessary. Next, should the United States support regime change in Russia? Now, while Biden has personally said that Putin must go, the official policy of the United States is no regime change. Next question, given that Russia's economy and currency are stronger than before the war, do you believe that U.S. sanctions have been effective? The Biden administration is probably going to answer yes to that sanctions have had a toll. And then finally, do you believe that the United States faces the risk of nuclear war with Russia? Well, I think they're aware that if they don't handle it properly, they could push into nuclear war, and they're trying to be measured and strategic so that they don't trip over that line. I think that's a fair interpretation of the Biden administration's sense of this. Now, before I go on, I want to say this. Just because someone lines up or doesn't line up with the Biden administration doesn't mean that it's liberal or conservative. In fact, in the United States, in foreign policy, we've been a lot more together than we've been apart in many regards. Let me give you an example. If you're a Republican in the 1940s, you might have been an isolationist, but you also might have just simply opposed FDR's domestic policies and thought Hitler was a devil. There were both kinds of Republicans at the time, and there are Republicans now who can despise Joe Biden's domestic policies while full-throatedly supporting Ukraine against Putin's aggression. To agree with Joe Biden to arm Ukraine and oppose Putin is not a sign of liberal sentiment. It's a sign of conservative bona fides just as much, but here's how you're going to see it. Now, by the way, before I get going and start to seriously unpack this with who said what, please like or subscribe. If you don't know me, my name is Gerdes. I'm a professor who has been tracking what's been going on in the war since the early days. In the summer, I started a YouTube channel, and there are more than 400 videos about Ukraine since the summer of 2022. This might be my most important. Please like, subscribe, share this video with people. Thank you in advance. Okay, back to the story. Now, this questionnaire was sent to presidential hopefuls, but only 3 have actually declared so far. That's President Trump, Nikki Haley, his former ambassador and the governor of South Carolina, and Vivek Ramaswamy, who's an entrepreneur. Now, the questionnaire also went to former Vice President Pence, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota, Texas Governor Greg Abbott, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, and former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. It also went to a number of other people I'm not going to mention because they didn't reply, but that's who we're going to focus on here, and that's who I'm going to address. So the first question is this: is opposing Russia in Ukraine a vital American national strategic interest? Now, it's no secret that Trump said no. He said no, but it is for Europe. Now, let's talk about some nuance. He's not saying we're anti-Ukraine. He's not saying I'm pro-Russia. He's saying, as the businessman who doesn't want to get entangled in wars, and remember, he made his bona fides opposing Iraq and Afghanistan after the fact and saying, Bush shouldn't have got us into that. He's saying no to war. Now, Trump went on and said that European allies should be paying more than we are or equal. This sounds like Trump. This is the way Trump thinks. This is the way Trump acts. He's always looking at the deal. Now, Ron DeSantis said, while the U.S. has many vital national interests, becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them. That was kind of disappointing because DeSantis has largely staked out some kind of middle ground between full-throated support and what Trump's position is, and he's kind of leaning toward Trump on this. Now, Kristi Noem is the governor of South Dakota. She's a MAGA Republican. She's in that kind of populist kind of Republican camp, and I don't want to oversimplify, but there's essentially two major wings. There's the old school Republicans and there's the MAGA Republicans who are more populist than they are conservative. And Kristi Noem is in that MAGA crowd. Noem pointed to China as the primary external threat, and she added that Ukraine should be Europe's fight, not ours. So that frames these questions with the three that are most reluctant, it seems, to get involved with Ukraine. Now, I should also say for the record that there's no anti-Ukraine party. There's no one that's pro-Russia in a meaningful sense. Well, beyond Tucker Carlson, who likes repeating the talking points. But there's no candidate that's going, Russia was aggrieved. And I mean presidential candidates. There are some people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and others that are saying some nutty things, but they get all the attention. The presidential candidates aren't saying that kind of thing. Now, on the other hand, Mike Pence touted the Reagan doctrine of fending off enemies on their shores to prevent America's direct involvement, telling Tucker Carlson, quote, "There is no room for Putin apologists in the Republican Party. This is not America's war, but if Putin is not stopped and the sovereign nation of Ukraine is not restored quickly, he will continue to move toward our NATO allies, and America will then be called upon to send its own." That's exactly my position. So there is a split within the party where I have some friends that are in that populist MAGA camp that say, hey, I don't want World War III. And I say, I agree. I don't want World War III. But what we're doing is quibbling about how not to get into World War III. Neither of us want a hot war with Russia, but then neither does the Biden administration. And that's really the interesting point. Tim Scott, the Republican senator from South Carolina, said that it is in America's interest to degrade Russia's military. Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, also said that Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a national security issue that threatens our alliances and standing in the world. So there's a pretty supportive wing within the Republican Party. Okay, what specifically is our objective in Ukraine, and how will we know when we've achieved it? That's actually a pretty good question. Now, Trump said it's to help secure Europe, but Europe isn't helping itself. If they're not paying their bill, they're not doing enough, that same kind of thing. But again, it's not anti-Ukraine like the liberal press would have you believe here. That's not what it is. It's just we shouldn't be paying the bill. And it's important to understand the distinction between what you thought you heard and what I just said. Trump goes on to say that it's very unfair to foot the bill because Europe takes advantage of us on trade and other things. Again, that's the way that Trump thinks. Now, Ron DeSantis said that peace is the objective, and in contrast, Mike Pence said victory in Ukraine is the objective. Chris Christie also said that the objective is to, quote, assist Ukraine sufficiently to enable them to defeat Russian forces and restore their sovereignty. Now, Chris Christie and Mike Pence have been fully throated supporting of Ukraine. Now, you haven't heard Nikki Haley. She didn't respond to this, but in other places, she's given a full-throated support of Ukraine as well. So they're on the other side of the equation. Ramaswamy, who is not very well known, he's an entrepreneur, said the objective is to, quote, respect any prior legal commitments the U.S. has made, and he cited the Budapest Memorandum. That's where the U.S. and UK and Russia agreed that if Ukraine gives up its nukes, we will defend their borders, and Russia's the aggressor. He added, however, that a benefit of this war has been exposing Russia as a paper tiger. So Ramaswamy would be on that side with Pence and Christie and Tim Scott. Now, what's interesting is Some of the time, what's happening is that these presidential candidates are taking a domestic swipe at Joe Biden, not just attacking or being ambivalent about Ukraine or whatever. So Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, said, if we had a president who pursued peace through strength, Putin never would have dared to invade Ukraine. Now, that's obviously a swipe at Biden, but this is also the way that Republicans think about it. To a man, Republicans tend to think that if Trump was in office, the Ukraine invasion wouldn't have happened. I know if you're liberal, that freezes your brain and makes it hurt, but this is how Republicans tend to think about this. Okay, the next question. What is the limit of funding and material you would be willing to send to the government of Ukraine? Now, DeSantis said that the U.S. should not provide assistance that could require the deployment of American troops or enable the Ukraine to engage in offensive operations beyond its borders. Now, before you put DeSantis in Trump's camp by saying that, he's in Biden's camp by saying that. That's essentially Biden's stance. Now, as good Republican, he also said our citizens are entitled to know how the billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars are being utilized in Ukraine. That's a very common Republican position on pretty much everything. Now, Ramaswamy on this question moves a little bit over toward Trump, saying that he would limit funding to Ukraine, saying that the allies needed to do a lot more because it's in their backyard. Kristi Noem said that we should not waste taxpayer dollars at the risk of a nuclear war, adding that we are already overextended ourselves in our largesse to Ukraine. Okay, that is a MAGA position. Now, Trump added that it would strongly depend on him meeting with Putin, and he stressed that Europe must pay. So here in Trump, we hear the deal making again, and we also hear that the Europeans need to pay their share for what's actually a European issue. Now, I don't see it as a European issue. This is a potential World War III issue. Mike Pence sees it that same way. Pence said that, quote, withholding or reducing support will have a consequence. He's right. He also said that the cost will be far greater if Putin invades NATO allies, right? He's looking at the bigger picture. This is where traditional conservatives actually stand on this issue. Greg Abbott slammed President Biden's blank check foreign policy, and that's a quote, blank check foreign policy. Now, a couple things about Abbott. Abbott is the governor of Texas. He's looking at this in comparison to what's going on at the border in Texas, where Biden's not really doing anything, and that's his big issue. He said this, quote, before Biden sends any more money or assets to the Ukraine border, he must enforce our immigration laws and secure our southern border. So if you understand that nuance, then you understand where Abbott's coming from. Tim Scott called for a, quote, accountability for every single dollar spent, unquote. That is a particularly common Republican position, but it's not anti-Ukraine. Then Chris Christie said, quote, it's on us to assist our Democratic allies in defending themselves against authoritarian aggression, unquote. That is that old school conservative position where I think the majority of Republicans actually are. Okay, the next question is, should the United States support regime change in Russia? And to a man, they said no. But the Biden administration also says no. Officially, that's the policy of the United States. The only interesting one here was that Pence responded by suggesting that the question should be posed to the Russian people, not to Americans. Next question. Given that Russia's economy and currency are stronger than before the war, do you believe that U.S. sanctions have been effective? Now, the Biden administration does seem to believe that sanctions have been effective. I've argued for a long time that sanctions alone don't do it. It's not a bad idea to have sanctions. Sanctions will add to it, but it's not going to do it in and of itself. You have to actually arm the Ukrainians so that they can take the fight to the Russians. Now, all the Republicans rejected the idea that sanctions actually did a whole lot, and that's a common Republican view. But the interesting thing in this article was Pence's response. Pence rejected the premise of the question, telling Carlson, quote, Russia's economy and currency are not stronger than before the war. He insisted that Russia's economy is in free fall and that its ruble is, quote, still afloat because of the extremely costly measures Russia has taken to keep their currency at pre-war levels in the face of sanctions. So it's not really having that much of an effect. That's been my position. I've said that all along, but Republicans seem to be pretty united about that. Okay, so the last question is, do you believe that the United States faces the risk of a nuclear war with Russia? Okay. Now, Trump responded by saying, quote, it depends on who the president of the United States is, but that it is absolutely a risk under President Biden. Well, of course, President Biden actually thinks that there's a risk. Otherwise, he would have armed the Ukrainians with far more weapons than he has. So both Trump and Biden actually see eye to eye that there is a potential of nuclear war risk if we don't handle this correctly. Christine Noem also slammed the Biden administration for, quote, taking us quickly up the escalatory ladder. Now, most of us conservatives in the old school kind of camp don't see it as terribly quick. We think Biden's been too slow. DeSantis warned that escalation of U.S. involvement in the Russian-Ukraine war, quote, would risk explicitly drawing the United States into the conflict and drawing us closer to a hot war between the world's two largest nuclear powers. But of course, DeSantis and Trump and Noem and Biden all agree that this could be a thing. Ramaswamy told Carlson that the risk of nuclear war grows, quote, the more that China begins to back Russia. So he's looking at that alliance. But Pence, I think, nailed it. Pence called Putin, quote, the small and bullying leader of Russia, saying that his nuclear threats were, quote, a bullying tactic, but he stressed that the U.S. will not be bullied. That's the old school conservative mentality. So what do we make of all this? So here is the cast of characters that I just talked about. And if you go from left to right, you'll find the least interested in helping Ukraine or being involved to the most interested in supporting the Ukrainian people against Russia's aggression. So you have Tucker Carlson, who's not a candidate, in the middle asking the questions, and he is very pro-Russia. And he's the only one pro-Russia. Everyone else is just, maybe they're absorbing some talking points or something along those lines, but they're not really anti-Ukraine. Trump, on this part, is let's make a deal. Europe must pay. It's not our fight. Let's not be involved. That's his position. Christine Noem is a little version of Trump in that regard. Greg Abbott leans this way, but he doesn't lean this way because he's focused on Ukraine. He's focused on the Texas border with Mexico, and that's really his position. DeSantis, he kind of has leaned a little bit to the middle on that. While these two clearly don't, and these two are somewhat in the middle, these five actually fully throatedly support Ukraine. And the leader is Pence. Pence has the clearest conservative view of what it means to support Ukraine and oppose Putin's aggression. Haley and Tim Scott, both from South Carolina, also support it wholeheartedly. You'll find the same kind of echo in Chris Christie. So while you hear a lot of squawking from the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world, Republicans, at least conservative Republicans, are very much in support of Ukraine. It's really the populist MAGA Republicans that are on the other side, but it's not that they oppose Ukraine. They just think this isn't our position. We shouldn't be involved in that kind of thing. And that's not supporting Ukraine. I get that, but it's a very different perspective. Now, I hope that nuance helps you and helps you understand where conservatives are coming from and how they think. If this was helpful to you, please do something for me. Please leave me a like. Please subscribe if you're new. I have 400 other videos about Ukraine. I am a conservative who full-throatedly supports Ukraine. Send this to somebody who needs to hear it. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.